Hey yo, what's up? It's VJ, the brother from the ancient mother, and you are watching another episode of the Headspace, Africa's most poignant hip-hop podcast, where we profile, uncover, discover, analyze, synthesize, and just generally tell the story of this beautiful culture called hip-hop in the continent of the motherland. Now, we're doing another anniversary review. Now, for those who haven't been following, the Headspace has for this year been doing a flashback into projects that have celebrated the 10 and 20 year mark, a milestone that is hardly ever celebrated on the continent, when artists who have laid very powerful foundations in growing the movement as it resonates and continues to evolve, and giving them the moment and the momentum to be appreciated, and just taking a look at how these projects have really aged. Now, I can't talk about this project without again putting a link into the description of an episode we did on the Mighty Outrageous Records, a South African record label which basically took the nooks and crannies of the potential spark of what was a grassroots movement in South Africa of hip-hop and translated it into forms which were on par with music industry standards, further giving hip-hop in South Africa the legitimacy to exist as a space and a market, demystifying the idea that at that time was very prevalent that hip-hop being American originated wasn't something which could find real identity and room on the continent, and further solidifying the careers of many an artist. Now, they did this through obviously great creative ideas, but it was this project in particular which really kind of became the glimmering sign that, one, there was a budding movement of young South African youth who not only identified but were playing around and experimenting with hip-hop as a South African format and finding interesting ways of doing this beautiful thing called rap in ways which could mirror the South African experience. Now, I'm talking about a compilation that Outrageous put out called Maximum Sentence. Now, I'm sure the purist hip-hop heads and OGs know what I'm talking about, but for those who are not familiar, this is a compilation that brought together not only the team of rappers who are affiliated with Outrageous, acts like Optical Ale, and when we're talking Optical Illusion, we're talking, of course, most notably Battle Cat, Golden Shovel. We're talking about rappers, apart from Optical Illusion, we're talking about Proverb, we're talking about Zubs, we're talking about just the whole entree of talent that the label had at that time. Now, for those, again, who do not know what Outrageous Records is all about, I am going to post a link in the description to the episode that we did, because there's massive education there into the story of hip-hop in South Africa as it grew, and it's a pivotal one if that's something that interests you. Now, back to Maximum Sentence. As a compilation, like I said, it brings together the powers combined of the rich talent that South Africa had at that time. Now, what it is definitely a time capsule. Listening to it today kind of really transmutes us back to a time where people were younger, and as a result they were more naive, more idealistic, more starry-eyed about the potential of what hip-hop could be. And I say that in a way that's both flattering but also an insight into how at times when we are driven by dreams alone, the sincerity of what pushes us can be somewhat naive, and we are not aware of some of the minor details that it takes to really make a plan work. Now, when I talk about minor details, how it manifests in Maximum Sentence is there was a clear, robust excitement to finally rap in a format which could be channeled on a professional level. The music could finally compete. Hip-hop could finally have a voice through these rappers who really were just young youth who are hungry and wanted to point their agitations at being made fun of and misunderstood as lovers of hip-hop in the country of South Africa. And a lot of the messaging is around that. It's around this archetypal enemy of rap in South Africa at the time, kind of pointing at it, critiquing at it, and for the most part just pointing a middle finger at the fact that there were naysayers who didn't believe that you could thrive and you could do rap in the context of Africa, in the context of Mzansi, South Africa to be more particular. And the messaging tends to be delivered in a way that's very aggressive to the point of abrasive. The energy is very teenage angsty. It's very rebellious in its tone, and sometimes it can get a little bit too much because it kind of becomes a straightforward assault on the ear, because there isn't much of a dynamic in the ways that the rap kind of delivers itself. It's one stream of consciousness which resonates on the level of an emotional excitability, and the project doesn't really tone itself down too much. But again, that just was part of the energy, and if you listen to the project with the context of where it was historically, you appreciate that. But if you're coming across this for the first time, a lot of the music will really feel rough around the edges. It'll feel like a whole bunch of guys just ranting and raving and screaming and throwing a bunch of big words into the air. Now, the appreciation for that comes in the fact that these were really people who were learning how to rap in songwriting format. It's one thing to love rap, to do it enough to get good at it at some point, but it's another to take those qualities and actually make a song which has all the dynamics of something which can be listened to over and over again. And I think a lot of the artists in this project didn't quite have that groove yet. I mean, even listening to early Golden Shovel, you can really see, and it permeates in the air, how they were inspired by this hyper-aggressive battle rap-esque kind of underground phenomenon, and really they were talking more to an imaginary whack MC, and the extension of that being this idea of the whack notion that hip-hop could not exist and be valid as a thing. And so as a listener, you might get lost in really being able to relate to the messaging, because it kind of basks itself in a lot of this complex terminology which was all the rage at that time, pun intended, and was really about kind of showing the verbosity, the complex poeticism, which was a flexing of skill. That was the flex back then, when you could throw together some words in ways which felt elegant enough to pass through and complex enough to feel really mystical and endearing. I mean, that was dope as an MC, but that style hasn't aged well, because truth be told, a lot of the cats weren't saying much beyond the approach to try and say things in ways that sound complex. And I think songs which really stand out as something a little bit more than that are Proverbs Joint, Letter to My Ex, which is really just that, a kind of somber moment of a failed relationship. Also, I must talk about how H2O was massively misunderstood and kind of really given a lot of flack at that time for applying this rudimentary Kwaito-esque flow. A lot of cats who tended to be more into the side of English complex raps have many a times accused H2O of not even knowing how to rap, and I for one think that is not the case. And you see this very, very, very well on their joint, and how their chemistry, just this warm tone of Amach Dasekasi, feeding from each other's energy and doing the kind of minimal, simple raps which were more about energy than they were about lyricism. And this is something that, ironically enough, can be appreciated about Maximum Sentence. It's rappers who probably wouldn't be in the same room together for long because of this the differentiation in styles. They probably would unify in the camaraderie of hip-hop, but to put H2O in one room, DJ Malik in the same room, Nell, Golden Shovel, there's a real kind of beautiful conflict which arises of the vernac and the hyper complex English coming together in ways that don't feel like a problem, coming together in ways that really show that rap has always been able to coexist in all of its different arms and legs. And I think Maximum Sentence stands the test of time in that way. It's a beautiful descriptor of the best that we had at that time and how all of these artists have subsequently evolved. It's a great way to kind of look at some of your favorites when they began, when they were trying to figure themselves out. And when you listen to it like that, you can't help but admire the level of skill they had just at that moment. Yes, there's a lot of monotonous qualities in the way that the samples tend to loop themselves. This is an early Battle Cat, and a lot of the times the beats have a flair and a charm to them that doesn't really go beyond the repetitive loop. And obviously he's grown since then, but even back then that was really advanced for the times. It was really a time where people were learning how to do that which they've been inspired by for themselves. And I think it's the do-it-yourself attitude which really grows beyond anything in this project. And listening to it years back, that's the primary note to take home. But now let's actually analyze the project sonically. Now, as I said previously, this project is pushed by a naive sincerity of youth, which matched up with the ambition to really validate rap, creates a beautiful nostalgia to bond to. There's a never-ending bombast which kind of tends to be the put-off, but behind that there's a real zeal to understand how to push lyricism to corners in which, haven't been discovered yet. Yes, there's a mimicry, there's an Americanization in the tone, in the flows, in the slang, but all of that is done with a heart that you can't help but feel was relative to its growth at that time. So you can't fault young Black South Africans for trying hip-hop out in a way that feels imitative, because really when you start something out, you start from that phase. And Maximum Sentence is the ideal representation of the beginning stages of something which would obviously become phenomenal, because here we are giving thanks to it 20 years later. And I think what this project does is that it's a quaint window into how the pioneers of rap in South Africa pushed a golden era that allowed for all the rappers you know today to even have room to breathe and have a voice. And I think that is something that we can commend and look at this project as something that literally laid the foundation for that. Sonically, like I said, it tends to be a bit monotonous, with the beats kind of ranging from the abrasive occult samples to the soulful jazzy sounds which tended to be associated with hip-hop, rap at that time in the ways that it manifested itself. So as a result, you find listening to it today brings a kind of childlike remembrance of earlier times. This project feels like when you go back to some of your fondest memories as a youth. And I think for all of us who grew around hip-hop and rap music as it evolved in the early 2000s in South Africa, this is a project which definitely finds itself in the annals of our mind, because what it does is that it situates how we rapped, what the inspiration was, and subsequently it tells the story of the ambition to make rap valid in this country. And I, for one, think listening to it now rings so powerfully in that way. Now, it is very difficult to rate something as it's evolved over time, because today it feels outdated, it feels rudimentary, and in many parts cringy, but I think you can't get to where we are if it didn't start there. So as a result, factoring that all together, I'm gonna judge this album just on the sheer capacity of how the MCs performed. And I think when you put together Nell's joint, H2O, Proverb, audio visual, Battle Cat doing his thing, Golden Shovel, you create a super team of rappers who were really showing that they could compete not only with Americans, but just generally in the whole world. They could speak their voice, they could make it known, and the cadences were on point, the enunciation was always strong, the raps, even as rapid as they were filled with confidence. Shout out to Golden Shovel. Even enough confidence to place his verse alongside a Cannabis verse and to kind of create this fantasy of collaborating with your heroes. And I think this is what Maximum Sentence ultimately represents. It's the youthful fantasy of the early South African rapper at cracking the world and also fighting for rap music in their country. So ultimately, today it would probably fall more along the lines of a 6.5 to 7 out of 10 because it's way beyond average, but it kind of falls back into a little bit of monotony when the production kind of centers itself in this very, very limited place. But I think if you would ask everybody involved in this project, they'd probably tell you that ish, we were starting out. So as a result, they probably feel a little bit funny listening to the music themselves, but it's that kind of cringe which also brings an admiration for the fact that we had to start somewhere. So ultimately, it's a classic in its historical significance, and for all those who don't know the avenues that rap has had to travel in South Africa, this is definitely a project you should check out. Maximum Sentence compilation brought to you by Outrageous Records. It had basically rappers that we all regard as legends of the game. Today I've mentioned them and I'll keep mentioning them over and over again. We've got Battle Cat, Golden Shovel, Proverb, Nell, Audio Visual, Mr. Selvin. Who am I forgetting, Takeza? Just the whole enchilada. And as a result, I say salute to the heroes, salute to South African rap as it's evolved. It couldn't have got where it is today without a Maximum Sentence compilation to really become the Aluta Continua to the revolution that still is rap Mzansi. I'm VJ, the brother from the ancient mother, here to constantly appreciate all those that have set the path before us and have kind of given us a hint at what is possible. And again, this project is a sign of beginnings. And we tend to look at beginnings in the way that they sometimes lend themselves to a clumsiness, to an error, and we dismiss people before they even grow. And I think there were probably a lot of people who were watching these cats go into studio and rap and be like, "Aye man, he says about my nigga, this will never crack, your bars don't match up, you'll never be as good as an American act." But here we are, years later, speaking of these very same songs and these very same people, trying to trace these stories because the growth was allowed. The room to evolve was allowed. So that's a lesson. If you look at somebody growing and they're not where they could be yet, give them time. And if you're going to give critique, give the kind of critique which seeks to motivate the person to grow. We don't want any dismissive energy in this rap game, in the South African hip-hop game, in this African hip-hop game, because all that really does is that it suppresses and it's an extension of an oppressor mind. And if you are an oppressor, you better get the fuck out of this space because it's all about positivity. Please subscribe if you haven't. This is the kind of content we keep dropping. We celebrate, we profile, and we continue to educate about hip-hop on this continent.